So it's 12. No, wait. Now it's 13. No, 14 failed drugs tests. Oh, hold on. Maybe it's 15? Welcome back to the channel. So there's been a lot of failed drugs tests. Now, I'm not a chemist or an expert in PEDs, but I know some people that are. So I will be speaking to them and coming back with another video to talk a little bit more about the actual testing protocol and really what's going on with that side of things. But not today. No, today I want to talk about the bigger issues surrounding these positive tests, or maybe the issues that go beyond what is obvious. And by obvious, I mean, an athlete tests positive, so whether knowingly or unknowingly they had something in their system while they were competing, that is deemed as cheating. And at this point, they've kind of got two options. Either they own up to it, or they give us the reason that they unknowingly had this substance in their system, and depending on whether or not that can be proven to any degree, we're going to see either a 4-year ban or a 2-year ban. Depending on the age of the athlete, that could mean that they're going to be coming back while still relatively in their prime, or whether that's kind of the end of their CrossFit career, at least in the elite division. These are the obvious things we see when somebody tests positive. But once again, I'm kind of asking, what's the bigger issues? What's the bigger picture here? And I'll be honest, yes, it's mostly negative, but I think I was able to find maybe one or two positive things coming out of all of this as well. So if anything, maybe this is another indication that the current structure of the CrossFit Games season doesn't really work. Now, while a 4-week gap between the first week of semifinals and that final week is great for spectators, coupled together with a live stream, it means we get an entire month of a manageable amount of CrossFit that we can watch each week. But it also means that those who qualify in the first week have basically a month extra to start preparing for their games compared to those that are qualifying out of the last week. Now, someone might say, well, a month or 3 weeks of training, is that really going to help them that much when it comes to the CrossFit Games? To which I would say, when I talk about having a month or 3 weeks of time to prepare for the CrossFit Games, for many of the athletes, they've got just as much admin to do as they do training. And I will get back to some of those points later. And of course, it also means that those that don't punch their ticket to the games but are going to go to the last chance qualifiers, well, once again, those from the first week have extra time to prepare and recover before going into the LCQs. So just looking at the calendar, before any fitness has even taken place, we can already start to identify a few issues. But this drug testing, or should we say drug taking, has added an extra wrinkle to the system. Because if we thought it was tough, the difference between qualifying in the first week or the last week, well, just think about getting backfilled from the 3rd or 4th week. So we've been told it takes 10 to 14 days for these test results to come back, but that doesn't really mean anything unless we're talking about negative tests. Because when it's a positive test and then we include testing the B sample and the appeal process, well then at this point, someone isn't just finding out that maybe they're going to the games quite a few weeks after everybody else, but potentially just a few weeks before the games begins. And now they need to quickly start preparing. And yes, they need to prepare themselves to compete, because there's a good chance that after all the work they've put in throughout the season to get to the semifinals and then missing out on that chance to go to the games, well, maybe they took a well-deserved rest from training and perhaps their eating habits have slipped slightly. They're maybe not in the peak performance that they'd like to be going into the games. So yes, they need to address that. But pretty much anybody coming from outside of the US also has to start thinking about the documents they need to process, the visa they're going to need to obtain, making sure they've arranged to take, the time off work, organize things for their family if they have family responsibilities. So there's a number of other factors that they need to take care of, not least of all thinking about the financial burden of going to the games. And if we're being honest, and as somebody that's taking a spot through a backfill, it's not that they're necessarily going to receive a massive paycheck at the games. Of course, sponsors and things like that could help, but we've seen a lot of fundraising being done. Well, now they've got a super short amount of time to try and get that done. in order to get themselves to the games in the first place. So it's a very real possibility that we'll see situations where people are invited to the games and either it's not going to be financially viable or they're just not going to have the time to get everything they need done in time to be there for the games. Oh yeah, and if that's an issue for one individual, if you're part of a team, just times it by 4. So speaking of backfilling, we run into another issue, and this isn't an issue for the teams, but it's definitely a problem for the elite individuals, because their season has already continued. We've had the last chance qualifiers. So that starts to muddy the water when it comes to backfilling. Who do we take? Well, logic would dictate that you would take the person that came in sick for that semi-final. So now how does an athlete feel who beat them in the last chance qualifiers? Maybe they think they've earned that person's spot to the games. Or what about the effect that they had on the last chance qualifiers? Yes, if we just remove one person, maybe that's not a huge change, but once we start taking out 2 or 3 different people, well, the scoring system would look quite different, wouldn't it? And as we haven't yet heard back from CrossFit regarding all the semi-finals, there's also the chance that an athlete could fail a test from a semi-final that would mean one of the people that won a spot to the games through the last chance qualifiers should technically be backfilled through the semi-final. So then we would need to backfill their last chance qualifiers spot through the LCQ. It starts to get very messy. People used to say it was difficult to follow who was going to the games through the sanctionals model. So let me know in the comments if you've got any ideas on how you would restructure the CrossFit Games season that could potentially eliminate or lessen some of these problems that we see from positive test results affecting so many different elements of the game season. And of course, another massive issue is public perception of the athletes. The idea of, these ones are getting caught, but everyone is doing it because if you're beating them, then everyone must be on PEDs. The idea that these athletes that get popped are sacrificial lambs. Well, at this point, it's starting to look more like a sacrificial flock. So I don't think it would be in CrossFit's best interest to be doing it this way, just to kind of give the impression of keeping the sport clean. Or I could say, at what point does giving the impression actually just become doing the thing? So that sort of deals with the sport, the games themselves. But I think there's a much bigger issue that needs to be looked at. And that is that it's not just a sport. CrossFit is a methodology for health and fitness. So yes, drugs in sport is a thing. Close your eyes, pick a sport. Guess what? Someone in that sport is using performance-enhancing drugs. We know this. But these sports are not linked together with health and fitness the same way that CrossFit is. They are not an advert for the methodology in the way the games was. And I know that looking at games athletes, they're not exactly the model of health, pushing their body to the absolute limit. But that's still very different from people outside of CrossFit looking in and saying, oh, you want to do CrossFit? Well, then you're going to have to be on something. And then talking about, CrossFit's reputation, we have to look at the way the whole situation is being handled. CrossFit spoke about there being more transparency in regards to its testing. Now, obviously, before they release anything, they have to be very before they can release something, they have to be very precise. They have to make sure that they've informed the athletes, that they've gone through all the different checks. But at the moment, the only way you're going to know if athletes are testing positive is if you go out and follow every single one of them on Instagram. Because this is what we see. As soon as CrossFit tells them that they failed the test, and a lot of them, maybe they know that the B sample, it's going to say the same thing. So what do? They get out in front of it. They put out a post, they release a story, and then that gets picked up by other people, myself, the Morning Chalk Up, Hiller, somebody will make a video on it, and that's how the rest of us learn about it. The problem here is that we know the person tested positive. We don't necessarily know for what, how much, things like that, unless they tell us. But we also don't know then how CrossFit will handle that situation. How will the backfilling process work? Who should be getting that spot? The people that should get the spot, have they been tested? Were their test results negative? So we can speculate, but with that lack of transparency and only having some of the information, and that information being from the person who tested positive themselves, it just becomes more speculation. So we really haven't had the levels of transparency we'd like, and to be honest, looking at the current situation, we really need. So it's starting to look pretty bad for CrossFit at this point, just the way the situation is being handled. Then we see what's going on in South America with irregularities in the testing. So it's definitely not the look that they'd like to have. However, people are getting caught. So some could say that's actually a win for CrossFit. CrossFit aren't the ones telling people to go out and take these things, but they are catching them. And catching them is definitely better than not catching them. And it's interesting, I got sent a message by Nick Britz. He had a really interesting comment that I just thought I would share. He said, testing and finding positive results that lead to people getting banned for 4 years. This removing them for the next 4 years, and hopefully CrossFit sticking to the ruling, means that others coming through will be discouraged from using PEDs. And I feel as if this is just par for the course of a pro sport. If you tested more rugby players, NFL players and whatnot, you'd find a lot more on PEDs too. So I thought that was an interesting observation that he makes there, that CrossFit catching more people could actually be a deterrent for people coming into the sport to not make the same mistakes themselves. So if somebody finds themselves on the fence thinking about doing it or not doing it, and maybe they're getting some bad advice and someone is telling them, hey, don't worry, just cycle off, they'll never catch you. Perhaps seeing so many getting caught already just after semi-finals could be a deterrent for people that are coming up in the sport in future seasons. So these are just a few thoughts that I had that I kind of wanted to get out there immediately, and just on how what we're seeing happening at the moment kind of plays into the bigger picture of the CrossFit Games season. As I've said, I will be speaking to a couple of experts actually with regards to testing and some different sports that are using slightly different protocols with regards to how they do testing. And I'll come back with something there just so we can kind of throw out a few more ideas on some ways we could help maybe improve the situation within CrossFit. So look out for that on the way soon. Anyway, thank you for watching, and hopefully I'll see you in a future video.